England, August 6, 1945. Dawn spills softly over the manicured hedges of a quiet English manor. To those passing the tall iron gates, it looks like any other countryside estate left over from gentler years. Inside, the windows are shuttered, watches confiscated, movements monitored. 10 German scientists sit around a breakfast table under RAF supervision, men who, a few years earlier, had carried the keys to Hitler's most secret dreams. Porcelain cups clatter. The wireless hums faintly through the static. At precisely 11 a.m., a BBC announcer breaks the calm. The United States has dropped a new bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, an atomic bomb. Silence swallows the room. Otto Hahn sets down his cup. The tea ripples once and stills. Werner Heisenberg blinks, confused, calculating before denial hardens in his eyes. One man mutters, "Impossible." Another laughs bitterly. The guards say nothing. They simply study the faces of their prisoners, minds that had raced the world and lost. Above the countryside, clouds drift slowly past the estate roof. No flash, no thunder. Only radio waves carrying news of a weapon that has just reset humanity's horizon. Within these walls, Germany's greatest intellects have realized their war ended twice, once in Berlin, and again today with words broadcast from America. In 1939, before the first Panzer crossed the Polish frontier, a very different war had already begun. One fought with notebooks, equations, and ideas. Berlin's physicists, chemists, and mathematicians were among the most brilliant in the world. The laboratories of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and universities at Leipzig, Munich, and Göttingen had built Europe's strongest foundations in nuclear physics. Yet in the feverish new order of National Socialism, truth and ideology were soon forced into the same uniform. That January, 2 German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, quietly published a paper describing an astonishing discovery. When uranium was bombarded with neutrons, it split into lighter elements. The process released immense energy. Their colleague Lise Meitner, a Jewish physicist already exiled to Sweden, recognized the reaction as nuclear fission and wrote its first scientific explanation. The discovery spread across Europe, but in Berlin its potential meaning struck a darker chord. Energy that could, in theory, make a new weapon, a bomb whose force might equal thousands of tons of TNT. By the autumn of 1939, German Army Ordnance gathered 13 scientists at a meeting in the Reich Education Ministry. They called the initiative Uhrenverein, the Uranium Club. Men like Werner Heisenberg, Karl von Weizsäcker, and Kurt Diebner were tasked to find out whether a nuclear chain reaction could be sustained, and whether such a reaction could be weaponized. Funding flowed directly from the Wehrmacht. Secrecy became law. Yet from the beginning, this club was a factional house. Rival departments hoarded data. Key materials, heavy water from Norway, graphite of proper purity, were scarce. Many of Germany's finest physicists and engineers had already fled Nazi persecution. Einstein, Born, Fermi's Jewish wife forcing his departure. The talent drain was invisible yet decisive. By 1941, the Reich was fighting time as much as enemies. Inside requisitioned university basements, the Uranium Club constructed experimental piles of uranium cubes stacked within blocks of paraffin. Their goal was to prove a self-sustaining reaction. Heisenberg believed the geometry could work, but his calculations underestimated the quantity of fissile material required. He thought a critical mass would be measured in tons, not kilograms. That assumption, a single line of mathematics, would spare Germany the bomb. As the war expanded, attention at the top drifted elsewhere. Hitler and Göring invested their hopes in immediate wonder weapons, rockets and jets that promised visible victory. Nuclear physics produced only theory, and theory fed no armies. The Uranium Club continued but shrank, losing budget and urgency. In hidden chambers beneath Berlin's KWI laboratory, Heisenberg's students kept refining experiments with uranium metal and heavy water, but never achieved sustained reaction. They lacked material. They lacked coordination. Above all, they lacked freedom of thinking under terror's gaze. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, refugees from that same intellectual exodus were drafting memoranda that would ignite history. In August 1939, before war's first shot, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Roosevelt warning that Germany might build a uranium bomb. That letter moved the United States towards action. By the end of 1941, as Wehrmacht columns surrounded Moscow, the American scientific engine began to mobilize behind code names. Manhattan Engineer District. Back in Germany, Heisenberg tried to persuade Army Command that a nuclear bomb remained a distant fantasy, and that the same research might, however, yield limitless power after the war. His practical caution became later his defense. Was it reluctance, moral hesitation, or simple disbelief? Historians still debate the answer. In the winter of 1942, the Uranium Club shifted to a new base near Leipzig. Atom pile tests ran cold, measurements unreliable. By 1943, Allied bombing forced relocations, experiments scattered in village cellars and castle halls. Within 2 years, the Reich that had dreamed of controlling nature itself could barely control its own retreat. Yet inside those ruined labs, the core concept survived. Uranium could split. They simply never bridged discovery to domination. Across Europe, physicists of every allegiance kept their silence, each believing, or fearing, that the other side might be inches away from success. The men at Farm Hall would later admit they had no idea how far the Americans had gone. What they couldn't know was that, while German instruments flickered weakly in basements, an entire city was rising beneath New Mexico's desert. There, thousands of minds worked in the open air the Reich had denied thinkers like Meitner and Bethe. In 1942, the atomic race diverged forever. In Germany, a club. In America, a civilization in motion. Across the Atlantic, the United States was doing something Germany never could, combining science, industry, and trust. In the winter of 1942, President Roosevelt approved what became officially known as the Manhattan Engineer District. The project's leadership fell to a collision of opposites. General Leslie Groves, a logistical bulldozer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and J. Robert Oppenheimer, a thin, chain-smoking theoretical physicist from Berkeley, whose imagination made mathematics feel like poetry. When Groves commandeered Oppenheimer's intellect, he built more than a laboratory, he built an entire city. In a few months, Los Alamos rose out of the New Mexican desert. The facility at Oak Ridge handled enriched uranium, Hanford managed plutonium, and together they formed a machine of unprecedented scale. The secrecy bordered on myth. More than 130,000 people worked within these fenced compounds, most unaware of what they were actually building. It was research turned into national crusade. In Germany, the fragments of the Uranium Club limped through stagnation. Heisenberg's team still lacked sufficient uranium metal, and their heavy water supply from Norway had been crippled by the famous Allied sabotage at Vemork in 1943. Even before Couleur's Norwegian commandos destroyed the plant, efficiency calculations told engineers they were decades behind any real production. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, later admitted that he never received a single report suggesting a practical atomic weapon could exist before 1950. Instead, German funding flooded into V-2 rocketry, where tangible results impressed the Führer. Colonel Dornberger and the young engineer Werner von Braun promised spectacular vengeance against Allied cities, and their rockets indeed reached London's skies in the war's final months. But by then, atomic vision had faded into scientific footnotes. Heisenberg's notebooks record meetings filled with arithmetic corrections and shortages of copper wire. The brilliant physicist spent more time scrounging than calculating. Allied intelligence suspected a German atomic program, but couldn't measure its pace. The British launched Operation Alsos, a scientific espionage campaign led by Colonel Boris Pash and physicist Samuel Goudsmit. Behind advancing Allied lines in France and later Germany, their teams located laboratories, seized crates of uranium metal, and interrogated scientists who suddenly claimed the entire project had been purely theoretical. What Alsos found in spring 1945 astonished Washington. Trivial experiments, no reactors, no clear design for an explosive device, and one small laboratory reactor hidden in a cellar in Hechingen. Germany's vaunted intellect had missed its own revolution. As the Reich crumbled in April 1945, Allied agents rounded up physicists before Soviet forces could do the same. 10 core members, Heisenberg, Hahn, von Laue, Gerlach, Diebner, Hartek, Bagge, Wirtz, Weizsäcker and Korsching, were transported quietly to England. Their detainment site was an old brick mansion outside Cambridge known as Farm Hall. Every room there was wired for sound. British intelligence christened the Operation Epsilon. By July, with Germany in ruins and Japan fighting alone, the men at Farm Hall settled into a strange captivity. They gardened, played piano, argued physics, and guessed what their captors planned. They assumed the Allies were interrogating them for knowledge they needed. None imagined that the Americans had already tested a nuclear device at Trinity Site in New Mexico on July 16th. When that test's mushroom cloud drifted over the Jornada del Muerto desert, it marked the moment the theoretical became real. Back at Farm Hall, the guards heard endless debates about America's industrial methods, the impracticality of mass separation, and why such a bomb would never arrive in time. The irony was crippling. Outside their walled garden, the United States was already shipping uranium-235 cores to Tinian Island in preparation for Hiroshima. The stage was set for an extraordinary clash of realization. The Americans who had feared a German atomic breakthrough were about to stun the very men whose initial research had inspired the Manhattan Project. It wasn't conquest through armies now. It was conquest through knowledge. By August 1945, the war in Europe was over. Yet the intellectual race these men once led was still unfolding, and about to end publicly with a single radio broadcast what began as a hypothetical in Berlin's laboratories would conclude in an English manner, with disbelief thick as gunpowder. When historians later combed through the Farm Hall transcripts and recovered wartime files, the irony was staggering. The Reich that had regarded itself as the fortress of modern physics was nowhere near building a bomb. Heisenberg's early miscalculation that a critical mass of uranium would weigh tons, not kilograms, had crippled the program from inception. The German researchers never created a sustained chain reaction. Their best reactor, loaded with hollow cubes of uranium suspended in heavy water, failed to reach criticality by a wide margin. Much of that failure traced to the scientific environment itself. Brilliant minds cannot operate under fear, their universities drained by expulsion, censorship, and the war's constant conscription. Jewish scientists like Meitner, Born, and Bethe, forced abroad, became essential contributors to the Manhattan Project instead. Every purge was an unseen transfer of genius to the enemy. At Farm Hall, the men tried to console themselves with arguments that they had simply lacked materials or opportunity. We could have built it had we wanted to, Heisenberg claimed. But the technical truth was clear. They'd dismissed the possibility long before the world changed around them. The split between theory and application, between ideologues and open cooperation, was the distance between failure and the flash over Hiroshima. The radio broadcast of August 6th splintered more than disbelief. It reopened old rivalries. Otto Hahn, whose 1938 discovery had made the bomb conceivable, sat staring at his hands, whispering that his chemistry had killed thousands. Heisenberg tried to console him with hurried calculations, still convinced the report exaggerated American success. Others mocked, "Ha, this is propaganda!" For 2 days, the prisoners debated in loops of denial and fury, while microphones captured every syllable. By the third night, realization set in. Heisenberg filled the chalkboard at Farm Hall's dining room with equations, checking the chain reaction math. Once complete, he grew quiet. Yes, they could have done it with enough separation plant. That acknowledgement gutted the table. Their scientific superiority, something Germans had worn like armor, was gone. Now they stood exposed as men who had underestimated both their adversaries and themselves. Even when the guards brought evening tea, an awkward silence remained. Pride had become grief. Within 24 hours, Hahn would mutter the phrase that haunted him to the end of his life. "I am the one who started it all." The shock was not only emotional, it was philosophical. For decades, German scientists had operated in small laboratories, valuing theoretical purity above practical engineering. The Manhattan Project inverted that hierarchy. In America, physicists were only one cog of a vast system fueled by logistics: miners, carpenters, machinists, and soldiers. To men who believed domination of thought equaled supremacy in war, the realization was bruising. Weapon power no longer resided solely in minds, but in systems, the coupling of intellect to mass production. Heisenberg's stunned comment, later declassified, admitted as much. The fact they could do it in such time is proof of their organization, not their physics. That idea frightened the Germans more than the blast itself. The Allies had demonstrated that democracy's disordered creativity could mobilize faster than dictatorship's rigid command. In a state that exalted obedience, the greatest achievement of all, improvisation, had become a liability. The quiet discipline of Operation Epsilon mirrored the war's changing face, intelligence replacing gunfire. After the BBC announcement, the British overseers at Farm Hall, under Colonel T.H. Rittner and Major S. Brooke, exchanged glances behind closed doors. They had prepared for disbelief, but not for the sight of once formidable intellects unraveling in real time. Hidden microphones captured everything, laughter turning to silence, disbelief curdling into calculation. The transcripts would remain classified for nearly 2 decades, until their release in 1992 stunned historians with candor bordering on confession. In the raw audio, the most famous physicists of Germany sounded suddenly very human, confused, jealous, humbled. One's muttering summed the entire moment. "The Americans are cleverer than we thought, perhaps even freer." Those recordings became a new kind of victory report, proof that not even the smartest enemy had foreseen how completely the war had shifted from ideology to intellect. The weapon that ended the conflict in Japan also ended any illusion of uncontested German genius. By the closing weeks of 1945, those 10 men still remained behind the walls of their counterfeit English manor, trying to reconcile ego, science, and loss. Outside the fence, journalists spoke of the dawn of the atomic age. Inside, silence thickened. Even the piano that had filled the house each evening went untouched for days. They were not prisoners of war anymore. They were prisoners of hindsight. The same stroke of discovery that had once promised Germany invincibility had condemned its scientists to hearing their own obsolescence announced over a British radio, while Germany's physicists at Farm Hall wrestled with envy and disbelief. Their military counterparts far from England confronted the same revelation in bitter isolation. The Wehrmacht's command staff, interrogated in Allied camps, listened as newsreels described Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To officers who had bet their reputation on Vergeltungswaffen, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the report landed like judgment. Generals Albert Speer and Walter Dornberger, both technical visionaries in the regime's closing years, immediately grasped what the atomic bomb meant. Speer later wrote that when he heard the first broadcasts, he realized all our dreams of salvation through technology had died that day. Hitler's empire had built the fastest rocket, the first jet fighter, and yet all its brilliance remained tactical, not decisive. The Allies had moved beyond machines to concepts, harnessing the heart of matter itself. Captured commanders spoke in understatement. Field Marshal Keitel's recorded comment to his cellmate, "So they found the philosopher's stone before us," combined wonder with shame. For a culture that revered physics almost as destiny, the loss was metaphysical. Germany's wonder weapon myth evaporated with the first uranium flash. After August 1945, technological superiority ceased to be a German word. Stripped of empire, Germany's scholars now faced quieter questions. As reports of Hiroshima's devastation filtered through the British press, the Farm Hall detainees debated morality. Many argued self-defense. They had worked on reactors, not bombs. Otto Hahn wept openly for Japanese civilians and begged that his Nobel Prize be withdrawn. Karl von Weizsäcker tried to soothe his colleague, arguing that such a weapon would have been catastrophic in Nazi hands. It was the first time any of them admitted, if only indirectly, the regime's monstrous potential. For others, morality expressed itself through rationalization. Heisenberg insisted that Germany's failure had spared civilization. Perhaps we have been protected from ourselves. But few believed it at first hearing. The transcripts reveal a psychological dance between guilt and relief, an inward acceptance that to have built the bomb for Hitler might have doomed the world. British monitors listened in silence. Behind their detachment lay grim satisfaction. The universe had chosen its custodians wisely. In the twisted ethics of victory, restraint through failure might have been Germany's last service to humanity. Outside Farm Hall's walls, the shockwave of Hiroshima radiated across every chancellery on Earth. The atomic bomb was not only science, it was diplomacy as spectacle. In Moscow, Stalin reacted without surprise. Soviet spies had already informed him, but his urgency doubled. In London and Paris, leaders saw both salvation and terror, and among the few remaining German officers detained under Allied guard, the lesson was brutally clear. Industrial democracy had out-weaponized totalitarian order. Propaganda broadcasts that reached Germany's ruins emphasized collective guilt, but also a new hierarchy. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, technological destiny had switched hands. Post-war German engineers would live in its shadow. Those evacuated to America under Operation Paperclip, von Braun's group among them, worked for the nation their government had sworn to defeat. Even their future rockets carrying astronauts to orbit would echo that surrender. At Farm Hall, when Allied newspapers arrived days later with photographs of the Hiroshima blast cloud, the physicists studied them wordlessly at the breakfast table. One turned the page over as if to close the subject. Another traced the rising plume outline with a fingertip, whispering, "Unimaginable." They knew the picture was as much a warning as proof. The superweapon was no longer theoretical. It was American policy. In the following weeks, the 10 internees divided into camps, those who still sought explanation and those who refused discussion. Evenings by the radio fell quiet. Heisenberg walked the orchard paths reciting equations aloud, while Hahn kept to his quarters writing letters he could not send. For scientists accustomed to ordered thinking, the event defied resolution. Their life's pursuit, understanding nature, had been used to crush cities. All the logic of the laboratory dissolved under the emotional scale of consequence. British observers noted changes. Laughter ceased. Newspapers went unread. Arguments dwindled. The transcripts from late August 1945 are filled with long pauses. The men still requested piano recitals, but no one touched the keys. Historian David Cassidy later described it as, "The day knowledge turned introspective." By early September, only one conclusion joined them all. The Americans had reached not just a scientific triumph, but a psychological one. They had made belief itself a weapon, convincing every enemy that resistance was futile against minds working in unison. For a Germany built on hierarchy and obedience, that realization cut deeper than any bomb crater. When the first frost settled over the English fields that autumn, the microphones at Farm Hall were finally shut off. The war of laboratories had ended. Behind the recorded laughter, silence, and outbursts lay the anatomy of a turning point. An empire defeated not by armies but by scientific vision executed with democratic ferocity. Soon those 10 men would be told they were free to leave, carrying home not data, but the echo of a radio broadcast that announced the future without them. The day was damp and pale, dew pooling on the lawns of Farm Hall. Breakfast smelled of coffee and unfamiliar peace. Outside, gardeners trimmed the hedges. Inside, the prisoners argued good-naturedly about neutron yields and pride. Then the radio crackled. This morning at 8:15 Japanese time, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. A harmless sentence, spoken in clipped BBC English. A sentence that stunned the room into static silence. Colonel Rittner, the British officer in charge, noted that everyone froze. Werner Heisenberg looked around the table as if confirming he had heard correctly. Otto Hahn whispered, "Mein Gott." Karl von Weizsäcker laughed without humor. "We never had the time," he said. A cup slipped from someone's hand, tea spilling across white linen. The war, long lost in Europe, had just ended again in their minds. For an hour they tried disbelief. Heisenberg insisted the Americans must be exaggerating. No one could have separated enough uranium-235. Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker proposed it was a bluff to frighten Japan. Others murmured mathematics into the air. Hahn buried his face in his hands, muttering that his discovery had been perverted into massacre. Upstairs, concealed microphones transmitted their voices to a van parked on the lane. British intelligence officers exchanged knowing glances. After years of guessing how far Germany had gone in its own atomic work, they were now watching the truth dawn in real time. The empire that once claimed mastery of physics had just learned it had been overtaken by an ocean and an idea. Within hours, the debate turned to fury. Paul Hartek, the chemist who had advised the German Navy, demanded that Heisenberg admit they had wasted the war theorizing instead of building. Heisenberg flushed red and fired back that physicists were not soldiers. Through the walls drifted voices rising and falling like surf, pride battling guilt. Late that evening, the BBC broadcast another report confirming Hiroshima's destruction. This time there was no laughter. The microphones caught only a low voice. Hans again repeating, "I am the one who started it." Then quiet, broken only by the distant clock striking 10. That night, Heisenberg could not sleep. Spotlights from the guards cast bars of light across his wall. On a small chalkboard, he began to work through the chain reaction math they had once dismissed. For 2 hours, the numbers refused to align. Then slowly realization formed. Yes, Gaussian, if enough fissionable uranium were assembled in a sphere, the chain reaction could propagate before the material dispersed. Not tons but kilograms. It was possible. At just past midnight, he set down the chalk and stared into the dark, mumbling, "They built it." The microphones recorded the scrape of the chalk, a sigh, and nothing more. Outside, rain flicked softly against window panes. By morning, the prisoners ate in silence. The newspapers arrived with the headline, "City Destroyed by Single Bomb." Photographs of flattened buildings, of a mushroom torrent rising from smoke. Unrealistic in scale, too large for comprehension. Hahn refused to read, sliding the pages aside. Gerlach traced the edges of the image with a fork. None spoke further. Upstairs, the British handlers prepared cables for London. They summarized the scene succinctly. Reactions as expected. Absolute confirmation that Germany's program never approached weaponization. Spirit subdued. Morale crushed. In Germany that same morning, across interrogations in rural camps, similar disbelief rippled through captured officers. One Luftwaffe engineer told of the atomic bomb asked, "Is it like our V2 but with fire instead of explosives?" A U.S. interpreter replied quietly, "It replaces explosives with nature." Nature. It was the word that unnerved them all. The Allies hadn't just advanced industry. They had turned creation itself into artillery. At Farm Hall, that concept sank slowly like a weight into the scientists' minds. All their purity of theory, all the years of equivalence and neutron constants, had ended not in a Nobel lecture but in a city made vapor. That evening, unlit windows reflected the estate's hawthorn trees. A playing card lay forgotten on the dining table, half dipped in cold tea. The men who had once worshipped calculation now faced the one equation no formula could balance. Intellect multiplied by morality equals civilization or extinction. And somewhere thousands of miles away, as dusk became dawn over the Pacific, another atomic device was being loaded aboard a bomber named Boxcar. The silence at Farm Hall was about to deepen, from disbelief to the grief of recognition. The world had crossed a threshold they could describe but not undo. August 9, 1945. 3 days after Hiroshima, the Farm Hall scientists gathered again around the radio. The morning sunlight lay thin on the parquet floor, their breakfasts untouched. Otto Hahn had barely spoken since the first announcement. Heisenberg rubbed his temples, repeating to no one, "They must have used it again." At 11 o'clock, the BBC voice returned. "Another atomic bomb has today been dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki." The words struck like the echo of inevitability. None doubted it now. America possessed more than one. And with that fact, every German justification for delay evaporated. Heisenberg turned to Weizsäcker. "It means they understand the whole physics, perhaps even centrifuge separation." The pride in his tone sounded hollow in the silence that followed. For 2 hours, fragments of discussion rippled through the house, badly mixed German and English signifying the collapse of certainty. The microphones caught them speculating on technical details. One estimated bomb weight, another guessed assembly method. Their voices wavered between admiration and dread. In the transcript, a stray sentence read simply, "Horrible, but splendid." That afternoon, British officers delivered Japanese casualty estimates. Pictures followed, flattened city blocks, shadows burned onto concrete. For the first time since capture, Heisenberg asked for a walk outside the compound fence. He looked toward a field lined with oaks, hands clasped behind his back. "Such a bomb," he murmured, "could end the world." Hahn, standing beside him, answered quietly, "It already has." The farm hall recordings note a shift at that moment, from argument to reflection. The men stopped defending themselves and began to confront what they had lost. Not merely a scientific race, but moral authorship over their own discovery. The Americans had taken what German science birthed and transformed it into the most consequential force in history. Germany's self-image as the crucible of intellect had disintegrated between two flashes in Asia. Across the Channel, in the interrogation wings of Augsburg and Nuremberg, senior Wehrmacht officers were told of the same event. Field Marshal Kesselring reacted with uncharacteristic quiet. "So they have found the ultimate artillery." General Jodl muttered, "If we had this, the world would be different." Their guards, American sergeants barely 20, looked at them not with fear but with pity. The German command, once dictating the tempo of war, now stood as spectators to annihilation delivered from the sky. Back in the Pacific, Nagasaki burned. The war that had devoured continents shrank to a single equation of surrender. At Farm Hall, the prisoners read the official communiqué that followed Japan's plea for peace. A long bureaucracy of words boiled down to one understanding: an idea had won the war. In those final August days, Farm Hall's yard became eerily peaceful. Plums ripened. Guards played cricket on the lawn, and from somewhere inside, a piano finally sounded again. Heisenberg played a slow piece by Schubert, each note thin, almost faltering. The microphones picked up Hahn whispering, "Of course he plays Schubert. Only a German could turn defeat into elegy." Inside another room, Weizsäcker wrote in his notebook, "The bomb was not built by evil men, only by men unconstrained. Freedom is the catalyst." It was a sentence as close to confession as any on record. For British intelligence, Operation Epsilon had achieved more than confirmation. It provided evidence of a nation's intellectual surrender. Groves and Oppenheimer, when later briefed on the transcripts, saw their own victory measured not in megatons but in astonished silence. The Germans who once terrified the Allied scientific world had been undone not by fear, but by disbelief. And in that disbelief lay the profound shift defining the new century. Power no longer wore medals or painted swastikas. It sat in laboratories, in patient collaboration, in the combined imagination of thousands rather than the will of one. Machine had replaced myth. Precision had replaced prophecy. The age of heroic individual genius yielded to collective intellect. At 9 p.m. on August 15th, the BBC announced Japan's surrender. As the broadcast ended, all 10 scientists remained seated motionless. No cheers, no outrage. Only Gerlach muttered, "Perhaps now our work can breathe again." That night, guards noticed lights burning in Heisenberg's room long after curfew. He was writing equations once more, not for weapon design, but for the theoretical paper he'd returned to after his release, still chasing meaning in neutrons and possibility. Outside, the English countryside slept beneath the tranquil sky of peacetime, while far beyond the Channel, cities across 2 hemispheres glowed faintly in the radioactive dawn of a new world. The atomic bomb did not merely end a war, it ended an era. For the men who once believed themselves masters of physics, it revealed the new empire, the empire of understanding, and they were no longer its rulers. Autumn 1945. The English air had turned sharp, and the fields around Farm Hall were mottled with frost. The war was over, yet 10 German scientists still lived behind high hedges and guarded gates, nominally guests but in truth captives of their own past. The microphones were switched off. The transcripts filed under top-secret Operation Epsilon. What remained was reflection and an uneasy peace. Werner Heisenberg resumed his morning walks with a small notebook, sketching equations on damp paper. Otto Hahn, newly restored to worldwide attention, received word he had been awarded the 1944 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. Belated news, delayed by the chaos of war. When an officer congratulated him, Hahn could only murmur, "That must be the worst joke ever made." His work had birthed an idea that others had forged into apocalypse. British intelligence agents reviewed hundreds of hours of conversation recorded since August. Their summary ran only a few pages, yet its implications filled volumes. The German atomic program was fragmented, underfunded, and internally divided. The leading scientists demonstrated technical brilliance but lacked unity of purpose. Most importantly, they did not grasp the decisive role of industrial coordination. That last line became the quiet verdict of the war's intellectual battlefield. The United States had married physics to production, thinking in scale. Germany's laboratory culture, obsessed with individual authority, simply could not compete with an army of cooperative minds. Meanwhile, in Washington and Moscow, the weapon born of that organization was already reshaping foreign policy. General Groves drafted memoranda noting that control of atomic knowledge is now the cornerstone of peace. In the Soviet Union, Stalin ordered a crash program to close the gap. The atomic race had begun before the ashes of Nagasaki cooled. At Farm Hall, the detainees were told they would soon be released. Before departure, Heisenberg asked to keep one sheet of chalkboard equations as a souvenir. A guard obliged, unaware that those chalk lines would later hang in museums as relics of a defeated intellect. In December 1945, the British deported the 10 men back to the continent. They stepped off trucks into a Germany that no longer existed. Universities bombed to shells, laboratories looted or dismantled by Allied technical missions. For men who once defined themselves by experiment, there was now nothing to measure except loss. Otto Hahn accepted his Nobel Prize publicly with solemn restraint, dedicating it to all who seek knowledge for creation, not destruction. Heisenberg returned to a teaching post in Göttingen, where he lectured to half-empty halls about quantum philosophy rather than warfare. Carl von Weizsäcker entered theology studies, arguing that scientists must become moral stewards of their own discoveries. None ever again approached state power. In the United States, Los Alamos scientists who had built the bomb were packing up as well, turning from victory to conscience. A kind of mirror existed across the ocean. In both nations, physicists stood at the same threshold of remorse, separated only by success. The Farm Hall men lamented what they had not done. The Manhattan team lamented what they had. Years later, when the Farm Hall transcripts were declassified, readers discovered something striking in the silences between the lines. They revealed not monsters or traitors, but men dulled by arrogance and fear, proof that intellect alone is powerless without clarity of purpose or freedom to pursue it. For the Allies, the recordings provided closure. The phantom enemy, the imagined German superweapon that had haunted Oppenheimer's nights, had never existed. But the moral riddle remained. If Germany had possessed the resources and freedom, would history have reversed? The question lingered in every think tank and lecture hall thereafter. For now, the once secret walls of Farm Hall stood empty, ivy crawling over eaves, sunlight pouring through cracked windows onto quiet floors. The guards departed. The radios fell silent. All that remained was an echo, the thin, disbelieving laughter of men who had learned too late that knowledge, unsupported by conscience, can perish as completely as any empire. The war of armies was finished. The war of ideas had only just begun. The world that emerged from 1945 was a different planet from the one Germany had tried to rule. Civilization stood at the threshold of an age measured not in front lines, but in frequencies and isotopes. For the first time in history, a single human decision could erase a city. The war had ended, yet in the minds of scientists, the race had only changed rules. In January 1946, news of America's atomic monopoly dominated headlines. The Soviets accelerated their own secret program, recruiting German specialists where possible, while Washington shielded its own under Operation Paperclip. The irony was thick. Men like Werner von Braun, whose V-2 rockets had once bombarded London, now wore U.S. Army uniforms, sketching the future of intercontinental weapons. The pieces of Hitler's shattered dreams became blueprints for America's next frontier. For the former detainees of Farm Hall, the atomic bomb was both legacy and warning. Heisenberg resumed research on nuclear reactors, strictly for civilian power. Hahn, haunted by Hiroshima, devoted his later life to nuclear disarmament. In lecture after lecture, he repeated, "Science cannot claim innocence by closing its eyes." Their reputation slowly recovered, but none escaped the shadow of August 1945. Albert Speer, giving testimony at Nuremberg, confessed that Hitler had always despised theoretical science as a refuge of doubters. That contempt had cost the Reich its most promising advantage. The Allies had built collaboration where Germany had built fear. It was a moral defeat disguised as mechanical failure. Dictatorship could command factories, but never imagination. across the Atlantic, the same scientists who had achieved the unimaginable felt the chill of conscience. Oppenheimer, called father of the bomb, now quoted scripture, "Now I am become death." Within a few short years, he too would stand on the margins of power, judged by the very system his intellect had served. The bomb had made gods of men and men of gods. It recognized no allegiance except knowledge itself. Germany, stripped of its armies, became ironically the champion of restraint. Post-war programs such as the Max Planck Society rose on the ruins of fascist research bureaus. Their charter began not with ambition but with an oath to scientific ethics. In classrooms from Munich to Hamburg, new professors cited Farm Hall as an ethical case study. Physics, they told their students, must never again be a servant to myth. The greater world listened sometimes. By 1949, both superpowers tested hydrogen devices, dwarfing Hiroshima's scale. The atomic age had matured into an age of anxiety. Yet embedded in that terrifying progress was the lesson born in the English countryside. Calculation without humility leads only to catastrophe. Heisenberg wrote later, "The scientists of Farm Hall lost a war but maybe saved mankind from itself." Had we succeeded, history would have ended differently, and perhaps ended altogether. Decades later, when the Farm Hall tapes were finally declassified, a new generation heard those voices, crackling, distant, human. Journalists expected menace. What they found instead were murmurs of regret and astonishment. Arguments about mathematics and morality interrupted by tea breaks. The emotion that lingers is not threat, but smallness. Proof that even geniuses can underestimate the momentum of free minds united by purpose. By then, the farmhouse itself had become just another building at Godmanchester, ivy overtaking its walls. Passers-by seldom realized they were walking past the birthplace of a new era. The moment the torch of scientific leadership passed irrevocably from Germany to America, the atomic bomb had done more than end a war. It had rewritten the structure of civilization. From that moment forward, power was measured in intellect and organization, not geography. The world's fate no longer belonged to emperors or armies, but to committees of scientists and agreements inked in sterile rooms. The age of conquest had become the age of calculation, and in that transformation lay the last echo of Farm Hall, the sound of brilliant men realizing too late that imagination without freedom is merely theory, and freedom joined with imagination can shake the earth itself. The story of the German scientists at Farm Hall is not simply the tale of men who lost a race. It is the story of what happens when curiosity collides with control. They began their journey believing intellect alone could serve any master. That knowledge was neutral, detached from politics or morality. By the summer of 1945, the radio proved otherwise. America's atomic triumph was not the victory of one ideology over another. It was the victory of freedom of thought over fear. In New Mexico's desert, thousands of minds, open and connected, achieved what scattered geniuses under dictatorship could not. Inside Farm Hall, the silence that followed Hiroshima was the sound of realization that creativity withers under tyranny, and collaboration thrives under trust. In the decades that followed, technology itself became the new superpower. The line that once separated laboratories from battlefields blurred forever. Physicists, once marginal figures, now found themselves shaping the destiny of nations. Every reactor, satellite, and warhead carried the imprint of that moment when a few men in an English manner first heard the word atomic and understood what it truly meant. Yet the deeper legacy lay in humility. For Heisenberg, Hahn, and their peers, the war's end restored an ancient truth. Invention divorced from conscience will always destroy more than it creates. The bomb was not merely an American weapon or a German failure. It was the mirror in which humanity saw its reflection for the first time. Today, standing in the quiet fields surrounding Farm Hall, one hears only birds and traffic from distant roads. No guards, no microphones, no secrets remain. But beneath that calm soil lingers the echo of discovery's most haunting lesson, that brilliance without freedom is sterile, and freedom without conscience is perilous. In 1945, both were tested. Only one survived. The German scientists left Farm Hall as free men, but the world they re-entered was forever caged by what they had failed to build, and by what others, less constrained, had unleashed. Their silence that morning remains history's most eloquent warning.